Creativity isn't, like, it's not all sweetness and light, man. I mean, the reason there are non-creative people is because creative people often died. They're out doing, like, screwy things. They attract attention from people they shouldn't attract attention from, like the authorities. You know, the creative people are revolutionary. Well, tyrants don't really like revolutionaries. There's lots of reason not to be creative. Even now, it's hard to monetize your creativity. Artists have a hell of a time surviving. So, creativity as such is it's a double-edged blessing. One of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity. Because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure, or maybe builds his or her own structure, you know, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't. Really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative. So educational institutions do a great job, especially before the university level, of just crushing creative people. Because the education system was actually set up back in the late 1900s to train the children of workers to be obedient workers. I mean, all the desks are lined up in a row. You're supposed to sit down, you're supposed to shut up, you're supposed to do what you're told. You do things by the bell. That's a factory bell that rings for recess and so forth. They're factories. You don't produce creative people in factories. You produce factory workers, and that's fine, except there aren't any factory workers anymore, so we should probably stop doing it. So here's a way of thinking about artistic and creative people from a biological perspective. So imagine that the world is basically an explored territory inside an unexplored territory. Every world is like that. Everywhere you go is like that. There's things you know and there's things you don't know. And the conservative people like to be in the middle of the things that are known. And they can master that space and they're good at maintaining it. But the artists like to be right out on the edge, and that's the edge between chaos and order. And they like to expand the domain of order out into the chaos. And they do that first by transforming perception. And you can see very concrete examples of this if you think about what creative people do in cities. They always do it, the same thing. So they're starving to death, and this is partly why. They go in a city and they look at some ratty area that's sort of quasi-criminal and that's seen better days, and they go there and they think, you know, with a little work, this could be cool. And so then they rush in there and they build some galleries and show some art, and they civilize it a bit, and then a coffee shop pops up, and the next thing you know, the yuppies move in because they're sort of creative but also kind of conservative, so they're the next ones into the frontier, and then the developers show up and they kick all the artists out. But that's okay, because then the artists go off and rejuvenate some other area, and that's what artists do, is that they're transforming chaos into order all the time. That's where they live on that edge. And so it's a very tough place to live because you can fall into the chaos at any time. You know, the thing is, I don't want to paint too dismal a picture about being creative, because one of the things that pays off big for creative people is that they get to be creative, right? There's great aesthetic joy in that, in depth. And I've been privileged because I've worked with more creative people than would fall to the lot, let's say, of the typical psychotherapist, because people often come and see me because they've watched my videos online, and people who are interested in those subjects tend to be creative. And one of the things I've really been struck by, first of all, I've learned that, for those of you who are interested in such things, that the reason Jungian psychology works is because it works for creative people. It doesn't work at all for non-creative people. It just falls dead and flat for them. They're not interested in it at all. It isn't how they think. It doesn't match their personalities. Whereas creative people, man, they dream archetypal dreams all the time. It's really interesting. And also, they die if they're not being creative. They wither on the vine. I had one client, I really liked him. He was a brilliant architect. His rational mind was his worst enemy because it just criticized everything. He was hyper-rational, criticized everything, and really in a dark way, and effectively, you know. If I could get him to not think and just create, he was a complete genius. That's where all of the vitality in his life was, you know. That's where the sap rose up inside the dead tree that was sort of embedded inside of him. And it is very common with creative people, is that it's their lifeblood, and it really is from a biological perspective. It's built right into people, and deeply.
The worst thing for creative people is to not be creative because they just die. Like maybe you're a tree with a few major branches, you know? That's your personality. So if you're extroverted, man, you can't be cut off from people because you just wither. And if you're agreeable, you have to be in an intimate relationship or you die, you know? And if you're conscientious, man, and you're unemployed, you're just going to eat yourself up because you have to have a duty and you have to carry a load because you just can't stand it otherwise. And open people have to be creative. They have to be because otherwise they die. They don't have any vitality. And so they're cursed with the necessity of putting a foot out into the unknown and making sense of it. And then they're also cursed with the necessity of trying to make a living while they're doing that. It's almost impossible to monetize creative action, as many of you who are creative will no doubt find out. It's very, very frustrating. It's not that creative action is without value, right? Because the creative people are entrepreneurs and the creative people revitalize cities and the creative people make things magnificent and beautiful. You think about what's happened in Europe over the last 1,000 years, say 2,000 years, this amazing, unbelievable collaboration to make things so beautiful that they're jaw-dropping when you walk into them. You think about the economic value of that, right? I think it's either France or Spain that's the most visited country in the world. It's one of those two. I think there's more tourists in France than there are people most of the time. And part of the reason for that is it's just so damn beautiful. You just can't stand it. And you think, what's the economic value of that? It's absolutely incalculable. And what's interesting too is that you build that beauty in, and then the farther away you get from it in time, the more valuable it becomes, right? Instead of decaying, it has exactly the opposite effect. Its value magnifies. And you look at these magnificent cathedrals that our civilization built over the centuries. They're still building the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, right? And it's an amazing building. I think it's going to take them like 300 years to build that. People in the Middle Ages, they'd start building a cathedral and they think, oh, we'll be done this in 300 years. You imagine the vision that it took to invest in something like that? We look at quarterly reports. We can't think 300 years into the future to build something of that kind of remarkable. They're trees first, right? They're a forest, right? The Gothic cathedrals, they're a forest, and the sun is shining through the branches. That's the stained glass, and they're the perfect balance of light and structure because they're representing something about the proper structure of being, which is something like the proper balance between light and structure. And they represent the sacred tragedy of mankind. That's why they're in the shape of a cross, and they're open to the sky. That's why they have a dome. Anyway, so that's what artists are doing. And so one of the things I would say is buy a damn piece of art, you know? Find one that really speaks to you and buy a piece of art because you invite that into your life. And really, it's unbelievably worth it because it opens your eyes to the domain of the transcendent. That's the right way of thinking about it. A real piece of art is a window into the transcendent. That's what it is. And you need that in your life because you're finite and limited and bounded by your ignorance and your lack of knowing. And unless you can make a connection to the transcendent, then you don't have the strength to prevail.